Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 656. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing? Doing well, Connor. Happy to have you back on the show today. We have a lot to talk about, but first need to mention the sponsor of the show, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2024, which is the world's largest offshore event and taking place entirely online from October 7th through the 11th. It's put on by Mikhail Thorup, the host of the Expat Money Show, and a highly sought-after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. So if you get your ticket to the event, you will discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth, and you will learn everything you need to know about crafting a perfect plan B, and that includes how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, and Tom Logano, and of course myself and antiwar.com news editor Dave DeCamp will be on a panel about World War III and answering whether that's fear-mongering or a genuine concern. So if you'd like to sign up for the Expat Money Summit, you could get a complimentary ticket by going to expatmoneysummit.com. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. You can also click through from the affiliate link in the show notes page. That way, they know you came from this show. And if you want a VIP ticket, you could get $100 off with the promo code Kyle. And so that's a great way to save a little bit of money. And again, when you use the affiliate link and use the promo link, it does help out this show. So please head on over and do that. Other than that, if you can just subscribe to the show if you're not already. Of course, we post the video version at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, and then the audio version anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. The show is hosted through the Libertarian Institute, and we repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. And you can follow the show on Twitter at @con_interest. Connor, let's get into the news today. This first one I have here is incredibly dark. It is a brand new in-depth report from Haaretz, a mainstream Israeli media outlet. And what they report on is the IDF using human shields in Gaza. And so what they go through and what they explain here is that these Palestinians who are used as human shields were employed without any choice in the IDF units in the Gaza Strip, and their purpose is, one, to act as human shields for the soldiers in the operations. And this is a quote from one of the soldiers who spoke with Haaretz, one of the IDF soldiers who spoke with Haaretz. They said that our lives are more important than their lives. Testified several fighters that in the end it's better that our soldiers are alive and that they explode from an explosive device. And when they say there were, of course, they mean the Palestinians. So the emerging picture is that in recent months, this has been happening all over the Gaza Strip with the knowledge of senior officials up to the office of the chief of staff. From the conversation held by Haaretz, it becomes clear that the most of the recruited are older men. However, there is evidence in some cases boys or very old people were also used. There were times when elderly people were actually required to enter the house, says a fighter in one of the forces. Mastery of Hebrew language is considered an advantage for the IDF when operating in buildings and in tunnels. They are required to the forces outside. The forces were required to go out and to check the tunnel that was in combat space, but when the fighters looked at the screen, they realized that the Palestinian had been sent inside, dressed in IDF uniform. His hands are handcuffed behind his back, and a camera is attached to his body. They heard very deep breathing. It sounds like he is a little scared, says a fighter who watched the video. They just let him in and he maps it out for the commanders while the brigadier watches from outside what he is documenting. And so, Connor, imagine this. They're not even, allowing these human shields to walk normally upright. Their hands are handcuffed behind their backs. There's others who are reported to have been blindfolded before they were sent in, and they have a camera strapped to their chest. In fact, one of the soldiers actually said that part of the reason this was justified was because the IDF had lost either so many dogs to death, injury, or some who were retired because they, could no longer serve due to the trauma they experienced in the 10-month fight, that these Palestinians were essentially just replacing the dogs. So back to the Haaretz article here, a fighter of the same in the same unit says that this is something that has been repeated before. Each activity, they would take out the human shield 10 minutes before everyone else and wait for the general in place. People started asking questions very quickly. A mass started around it, around the situation. There were those who claimed that they were not ready to carry out operations activity if I dare to sacrifice him, push the Palestinian to go forward. Of course, there were some who supported it, but at least with us, they were alone, especially the commandos who were afraid to face the senior officers. And so, Connor, it just goes on and on with this misery of how they forced these people into tunnels, into buildings, and that some of them were killed, including by the Israeli soldiers themselves. And, most of the time they were used for days at a time. They were kept in handcuffs and blindfolded the entire time. They would, be forced to defecate on themselves. They would have the Israeli soldiers feed them when they wanted to eat. And so just an absolute horror show here. All right, so one more article before I hand it over to Connor. White House says U.S. is prepared to defend Israel from significant attack. So the White House said Monday that the U.S. is prepared to defend Israel from a significant Iranian reprisal attack as the U.S. continues to bolster forces in the region. The U.S. and Israel are expecting Iran to launch a response to the Israeli killing of a Hamas political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, and think that that could happen this week. Iran's allies, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, may also participate in the operation. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said, "We share the same concerns and expectations that our Israeli counterparts have with respect to potential timing here. Could be this week. We have been prepared for what could be a significant set of attacks. The U.S. has helped defend Israel when Iran launched its first ever attack on Israeli territory in April, which was provoked by the bombing of an Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. We obviously don't want to see Israel have to defend itself against another onslaught like they did in April, but if that's what comes at them, we will continue to help them defend themselves." That is again from Kirby. A day earlier, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told his counterpart Yoav Gallant that he had ordered the deployment of the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and its strike group to be accelerated. He also told Gallant the U.S. was sending the USS Georgia, a guided missile submarine, to the region. Secretary Austin reiterated the United States' commitment to take every possible step to defend Israel and noted the strengthening of U.S. force posture and capabilities throughout the Middle East in light of the escalating regional tensions. A Pentagon readout of the call between Austin and Gallant said, "The new pledge from the United States to defend Israel came after a poll conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found that the majority of Americans, 56%, oppose the idea of sending U.S. troops to Israel to defend it from Iran." And of course, Connor, what would be even the point of this great democracy they're always crowing about if when the majority of Americans oppose something, the U.S. government does it anyways? All right, now I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you got quite a few articles that you want to talk to us about today.
Democracy is on the ballot, and yet when it comes to the most important issues, we have absolutely no choice. So this story, again, this is sure to inflame tensions with the axis of resistance, let alone the broader Palestinian population. This is from Dave DeCamp today, August 13th. Ben-Gvir says changing status quo at Al-Aqsa is our policy in latest provocative visit to the religious site. So on Tuesday, Israeli Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir made another provocative visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem, known as the Temple Mount to Israelis. and rejected statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu that the status quo at the sensitive religious site hasn't changed. Under the decades-old status quo at Al-Aqsa, non-Muslims can visit the site, but they cannot pray there. Ben-Gvir made 2 visits to the site last month and declared Jewish prayer was permitted, and both times Netanyahu quickly released a statement saying the status quo hasn't changed. Undeterred, Ben-Gvir said on Tuesday that it was, quote, our policy to allow Jewish prayer at Al-Aqsa. Quote, there is great progress here on sovereignty and rule. Images of Jews praying here, as I've said, our policy is to allow prayer, he said in a video with Al-Aqsa Mosque Dome of the Rock in the background. Now, Netanyahu's office again issued a statement rebuking Ben-Gvir. It said, "Is the government and the prime minister who determine policy on the Temple Mount. There is no private policy of any minister, not the national security minister or any other minister on the Temple Mount. Thus, it has been under all governments of Israel," the office said. Now, this morning's incident on the Temple Mount deviated from the status quo. Israel's policy on the Temple Mount has not changed. That is how it has been, and that is how it will be, the office statement continued. So Ben-Gvir, the leader of the Jewish Power Party, was accompanied by dozens of Israelis who were seen praying at Al-Aqsa, which was permitted by the Israeli police. Ben-Gvir's position as Minister of National Security puts him in charge of the police, making his declarations all the more provocative. Now, Al-Aqsa and the rules around it are one of the most sensitive issues between Israelis and the Palestinians. Palestinians view any change of the status quo as a sign that Israel could be moving to take over the mosque, which is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. Israeli police raids on Al-Aqsa were a major motivation for Hamas's attack on southern Israel back on October 7th, which was dubbed Al-Aqsa Flood. A source close to Hamas told Reuters back in October of 23 that, quote, it was triggered by scenes and footage of Israel storming Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, beating worshippers, attacking them, dragging elderly and young men out of the mosque. All this fueled and ignited the anger. And of course, we had predicted on the show that this was going to provoke some kind of escalation. I mean, I figured that at the time that there would be a larger war on Gaza between Hamas and Gaza at the time. It seems like Hamas was being more strategic, and it was some of the other resistance groups in the Strip that were retaliating for the attacks on Al-Aqsa during Ramadan last year. So there was a smaller bombing campaign against Gaza, I believe in May. And this would have been around the same time they were bombing Lebanon as well. And so this kind of provocation, whether or not Netanyahu's office is being sincere, for one thing, it demonstrates just how much of a provocation it is if indeed the prime minister's office is being sincere and saying, hey, this is a bridge too far. We're not behind this. We do not support this. On the other hand, really, Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the other hardliners in the coalition have been working hand in hand, boosting and the most escalatory policies regarding the war and the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank as well. So, especially with this coming on the eve, so to speak, of this Iranian reprisal attack, I think we're just going to see that much more of a risk of things really spilling out of control. But that is clearly what men like Ben-Gvir want. And as you mentioned earlier, Kyle, the bipartisan establishment in the United States will not have any substantive opposition to this whatsoever. I mean, they like to use Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as kind of scapegoats to say, or even Netanyahu to some degree, to say that, well, Israel is a great beacon of democracy in the Middle East and they're our closest ally, et cetera, et cetera. We have to help them defend themselves. When really that's just code for completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, either in part or in whole. And they would pretend that these people are aberrations when really they're more a reflection. They're a better reflection of Israeli society than any kind of rhetoric we hear from Americans about how valuable Israel is and how they're an ally, which is pretty unfathomable, especially at this point. I mean, we can even see anybody paying attention can see that, as you said, 56% of Americans are opposed to the U.S. being dragged into this war with Iran to defend Israel against Tehran or any of the other allies or countries or groups that Israel is picking fights with, knowing that Uncle Sam will be right there with its young men and women ready to die for this apartheid state. And so, again, this just reflects the continuing disaster of U.S. Israeli policy under the Biden administration and sure to be under the next Trump administration as well. Okay, now again, getting into some real macabre figures of the reality of the war on Gaza. Nearly 2% of Gaza's population has been killed by the U.S.-Israel war machine. This one's from the Cradle news desk from the 12th. Nearly 2% of the Gaza Strip's entire population has been killed by Israel during its genocidal war on the Strip, according to figures released on August 11th by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics. The Bureau said in a statement that Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 39,000 Palestinians, and this constitutes around 1.8% of the total population of the territory, PCBS said. Now, according to the data, approximately 24% of those killed by Israel in Gaza are youths. The data goes on to show that 34 people so far that we know of have died as a result of the famine that has struck the entirety of the besieged enclave, and they add that 3,500 children are at risk of death from malnutrition and shortages of food. And about 70% of the wounded in Gaza are women and children. The PCBS revealed. It adds that 10,000 people are missing and that around 2 million people have been displaced. Between October 7th and late June, Washington was behind the delivery of nearly 30,000 bombs to Israel, which has been used without restriction in its war on the Strip. And that's not to say nothing of the tens of thousands of artillery shells and other weapons that have also been shipped just since October 7th to Tel Aviv. Now, the death toll in Gaza has risen to 39,897 people, with 91,152 injured, according to medical sources cited by the Wafa news agency yesterday on the 12th. And of course, medical sources told the agency that the news agency that, quote, emergency services are still unable to reach many casualties and dead bodies trapped under the rubble or scattered on roads across the war-torn enclave as Israeli occupation forces continue to obstruct the movement of ambulance and civil defense crews, which is standard practice, whether that be in the Strip or in the West Bank. Meanwhile, counting the dead and injured has become increasingly difficult for the health ministry as the war drags on because, of course, so many of the hospitals have been destroyed and the health system has been nearly decimated. And traditionally, they rely on hospital officials to count the dead in their morgues, and that's become increasingly impossible to do with the way the war is being carried out with, as we've discussed, I mean, more than half of the buildings in the entire Strip have been destroyed, and you have bombings going on in the south, southern Gaza, central Gaza, and northern Gaza. And so many of these people are ending up in mass graves, and we may never know actually the true excess death rate. Because again, one of the other complaints of human rights orgs that have been trying to find out the true status of the famine and the starvation crisis have said the same thing that the people who are trying to estimate how many people have been killed have been complaining about, which is that because of the way Israel is carrying out its war effort against the Palestinians in Gaza, there is no way to get in there and safely count the dead or find out exactly the reality of the level of starvation. We've known for months and months the top international watchdog on famine, the Integrated Security Food Classification, has said that they're at much of the Strip, hundreds of thousands, I mean 500,000 are at the level 5 catastrophic level of starvation. And so we can only imagine what the true results of this campaign will be when it's over. And people really can only do guesswork now. I mean, whether it was that article that appeared in Lancet recently discussing the potential for hundreds of thousands of casualties, even if the war stopped now, I mean, that's just an estimate. We really don't know. But we can see every day. I mean, we just saw this other massacre on a school in Gaza City over the weekend with more than 100 people killed. And that's just the status quo. That is exactly what our government supports wholeheartedly, and probably everybody listening to this, your congressman is absolutely totally okay with it and wants you to pay for it. So this next story, back to the West Bank, over 1,000 women and children captured by Israel in the West Bank since October 7th. So again, this is from the Cradle. Israeli forces have made 10,000 arrests in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem since the start of the war on Gaza, according to a brief released by several Palestinian prisoner organizations on August 12th. The total number of arrests stands at 10,000 in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The Commission of Detainees Affairs, the Palestinian Prisoners Society, and the Adamir Association for Human Rights said in a joint brief released on Monday. So since October 7th, 345 women and 700 children have been imprisoned in the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. According to the brief, it adds that 94 journalists have been detained, and 53 of whom are still in custody. Now, more than 8,322 orders of administrative detention have been issued since October 7th, ranging between new orders and renewals, including orders against children and women, the brief goes on to say. So these people are being locked up with no charges and no trials. Detention campaigns carried out since October 7th are accompanied by escalated crimes and violations such as humiliation, brutal beatings, threats against detainees and their families, besides vandalism and destruction in detainees' houses. Vehicles have been confiscated along with gold and money, in addition to the destruction of infrastructure, especially in the refugee camps of Tulkarem and Jenin. So at least 22 Palestinians have died in Israeli custody, according to the official numbers, the brief states. This is aside from dozens of prisoners from the Gaza Strip whose deaths in custody remain unannounced. And the brief adds that the total number of prisoners known to be held in Israeli prisons currently stands at 9,900. It goes on to say the data does not include the detention cases of Gaza due to the occupation's refusal to give any information and the continuation of the practicing of the crime of It is worth mentioning that the occupation forces arrested about 4,000 citizens from Gaza in addition to hundreds of Gazans who were arrested in the West Bank. It also says the data is variable on a daily basis due to the continuous arrests. So the already brutal prison system took a turn for the worse in 2022 under Netanyahu's government when Ben-Gvir assumed control of the National Security Ministry. And Kyle reported on this recently, but this is on the heels of his B'Tselem, the premier Israeli human rights organization, publishing a report that saying that since October 7th, the prisons and detention centers have effectively become torture camps under Ben-Gvir's rule. And the report is called Welcome to Hell and contains the testimonies of 55 Palestinians who collectively point to a, quote, systematic and institutional policy of abuse and torture of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, according to Haaretz. And then they note here that there is a sort of a internal dispute because the head of Shin Bet is warning that there's an incarceration crisis. Now you have 21,000 Palestinians locked up in prisons across Israel, and he's saying that this is a time bomb and that essentially Ben-Gvir's policy is to blame. And as I said, he says that it's a huge powder keg, and he says that the capacity for their prison should include no more than 14,500. Hence why Ben-Gvir has publicly said, essentially starving the prisoners, not to death, but almost to that level of malnutrition. And the fact that he can just say that publicly in videos online is unbelievable. Again, as I said, our politicians have nothing to say about it really. And then, he's also discussed just executing people who have not been charged and they've not seen a trial and they don't have any legal representation. And he says he just killed them to make room in these prisons. So this is our supposed closest ally, who we must do anything and everything to protect from anybody that they choose to slaughter. So this next story, they're shooting U.S. citizens. The IDF is shooting U.S. citizens. Again, this story is from Middle East Eye. Israeli forces shoot U.S. citizen in occupied West Bank. So Israeli forces shot and injured an American citizen during a demonstration on Friday being held in Betia, a Palestinian village near the West Bank town of Nablus. Several Palestinian rights organizations have told Middle East Eye. Now, they're using a pseudonym to protect the victim here, but so for the sake of the article, Amado Sisan was hit by a bullet that shot through the back of his right thigh and left a large exit wound. The bullet, however, missed all of Sisan's major arteries and his bones, but he has soft tissue damage from the attack, according to Vivi Chen, an activist with Defend Palestine. Chen was also the victim of an attack by Israeli settlers last month. Sisan was carried more than 500 meters as Israeli forces continued to attack Palestinians gathered at the site of the demonstration. After being shot, activists said that his ambulance was forced to stop at several Israeli checkpoints, leading to a delay in his medical treatment. Eventually, he underwent a successful surgery and was seen smiling in his hospital room. A State Department spokesman told Middle East Eye that Washington was aware of the incident and was in contact with the local authorities to get more information. We are greatly concerned when any U.S. citizen is harmed overseas and work to provide consular assistance, the spokesman said. We reiterate our advice to U.S. citizens to reconsider travel to the West Bank. Over the past few months, there has been an increase in extremist violence and military activity. And again, this just shows, who do they really work for? I mean, I'm not, it's just unbelievable because you have American citizens who were brutally beaten by Israeli settlers, I believe last month. And then, I mean, you have obviously Shireen Abu Akleh. They blew her face off. The Palestinian American Christian journalist who worked for Al Jazeera for, she was known as the voice of Palestine for about 2 decades. She was covering a raid on the Jenin refugee camp back in May of 2022. And an Israeli sniper shot her right in the face, an American citizen. And then about 2 months later, Joe Biden went to Jerusalem and hugged um, Yair Lapid, who was prime minister at the time, and told him, we are committed. We have an ironclad commitment to Israel and its defense. I no ifs, ands, or buts, and our ties are bone deep. Gave him a big hug, and it was, a major slap in the face to not only her family and her loved ones, but to every one of us. And again, I mean, you even talk about Rachel Corrie during the Second Intifada, an American college student who was run over by the IDF and an Israeli bulldozer because she was protesting a home demolition in the Gaza Strip. So there's a history of American citizens being murdered. And the Israeli government, getting, if anything, maybe a slight slap on the wrist, and really just rhetorically, never any consequences. And we just saw this recent Israeli, this IDF battalion is receiving funding from the IDF, or excuse me, from the United States, even after they killed an American citizen in the West Bank back in 2022. And so so the State Department put out their, boilerplate response. We reiterate our advice that you should reconsider travel to the West Bank because our greatest allies' military might shoot you. The shooting took place against the backdrop of a 6-week-long campaign by Israeli settlers, accompanied by Israeli soldiers who are antagonizing the Palestinian residents of Betya. In June, the Israeli Security Cabinet legalized the illegal Edvitar settlement outpost in the lands of Betya and has since been repopulated with Israeli settlers. Palestinians have been demonstrating against the settlement since it was first erected in 2013, and in recent weeks, those protests have reignited with the goal of stopping the dispossession of Palestinian land. Of course, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister who holds the occupation governor's post in the defense ministry with this new position that's been created for him since Netanyahu came to power in December of 2022, recently announced the largest settlement expansion in over 30 years in the West Bank. And so Palestinians have been demonstrating against, the dispossession. Israeli forces have been using violent means against the protesters, including tear gas and live ammunition. A total of 17 people have been killed in Betya by Israeli forces or settlers since 2020. So the groups Defend Palestine, Pal Shield, and the International Solidarity Movement put out a joint statement that says 10 months into Israel's U.S.-funded genocide under the guise of war, of the Gaza war, we stand in unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian resistance and the popular resistance in Betya. Israeli settler violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank has soared since the beginning of Israel's war on Gaza last October. Of course, they've killed well over 500 Palestinians in the West Bank. That's the IDF and the settlers, but it's mostly the IDF. And these numbers are from the UN. The High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, Volker Turk, said in a report that cases of these killings show consistent violations of international human rights law on the use of force by the Israeli security forces through unnecessary and disproportionate use of lethal force, and an increase in apparently planned targeted killings. And of course, continuing to fund a military that acts like this is illegal under U.S. law as well, like the Leahy laws, for example. So that's you just have more evidence that the Israeli military can kill American citizens or shoot American citizens and absolutely get away with it. In fact, what the State Department will tell you to do is, well, you shouldn't be there in the first place. And of course, the people that were being beaten last month were doing the same thing, helping Palestinians work on their farms and just showing solidarity and protesting the actions of the settlers, and they got brutalized for it. Okay, so this next story, actually, this is my last story. This is about Iranian politics. And this sort of offers, the most interesting thing to me about this recent Iranian presidential election is the fact that a moderate was elected. named Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, who wants direct negotiations with the United States, wants to cut out the intermediaries and these long, drawn out talks that we saw in Vienna during the Biden administration, these indirect talks with the P5+1 parties, where nothing ever really gets done. You know, they constantly suffer Israeli attacks and sabotage attacks and assassinations as the talks are ongoing. They make all kinds of concessions, and the Americans just completely dismiss any possibility of just reaching an agreement with Iran when all they have to do is re-enter the JCPOA, which was the most stringent civilian nuclear energy program inspections regime ever implemented by the IAEA in its history. Of course, Iran has been a member of signatory, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty since well, for more than 50 years, and so it's never been a real issue. I mean, the most almost everything you've ever heard about Iran trying to build a nuclear weapon is not true. And so, but it's used by the Israeli lobby and by hardline politicians in the U.S., the neoconservatives especially, as a way of maintaining this constant acrimony with Iran. And now we find ourselves potentially in the brink of war with a country of 80 million people that we really have no reason to be at odds with. And so the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran was timed, at least from the Israeli perspective, perfectly to sabotage any attempt at diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran, which you can always count on the Israelis to do. We've covered it, a myriad of times on this show. So Reuters reports Iran's new president presented his cabinet to parliament on Sunday for a vote of confidence. State media reported proposing seasoned pragmatic diplomat Abbas Arakchi as foreign minister at the time of heightened regional tensions. So Pezeshkian is shaping his cabinet at a time of increased risk of escalation of the conflict in Gaza into a broader regional war after the recent killings of the Palestinian group Hamas's leader Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader in Iran, and of Hezbollah military commander Faoud Shakur in Beirut, which has drawn threats of retaliation against Israel. So following the death of Ibrahim Raisi, the former president, in a helicopter crash in May, Pezeshkian won a snap election last month by promising to improve ties with the world, particularly the West, promoting a pragmatic foreign policy and to ease social restrictions at home. So this is like a red carpet for the Biden administration, really. For all the talk about how hardline Raisi was and how impossible it was to negotiate with him, that was never true. I mean, we covered all kinds of examples of the Iranians conceding and being faithful to the indirect negotiations. It was the U.S. that remained obstinate under Tony Blinken's leadership at the State Department. But so Pezeshkian's proposed cabinet lineup requires lawmakers' approval and Parliament Speaker Mohammed Bakr Qualibaf. Requires lawmakers' approval and Parliament Speaker. He said that parliamentary commissions will start reviewing his candidates on Monday, which would have been the Monday of this week. Argachi, who's 61, was Iran's ambassador to several countries, including Japan, and played a key role in negotiating the 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with 6 world powers, which then U.S. President Donald Trump illegally exited in 2018, reimposing sanctions on Iran, although Obama never lifted those sanctions in the first place, unfortunately, and they've only been expanded under the Biden administration. So Argachi later led Iran's negotiators during the multilateral efforts, ultimately unsuccessful, to revive the pact via the indirect diplomacy with Washington before he was replaced by the hardliner Ali Bagheri Khani in 2021. Again, Bagheri Khani was leading those talks in Vienna during the Biden administration. And so the Reuters is kind of being a little bit disingenuous here. I mean, he made his best effort. And separately, Iran's president nominated Mohsen Pakhanezad as oil minister, who has served as deputy oil minister overseeing hydrocarbon resources between 2018 and 2021. Pezeshkian has also nominated Farzanarek Sadek as the road and transportation minister. If approved by the parliament, she would become the second woman cabinet minister in the Islamic Republic's history. The first one was appointed in 2019 by hardliner Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was president at the time. Under the president's proposed lineup, Raisi's intelligence minister Esmail Khatib would keep his position in the new cabinet. So here you have, and the president, they just note here that the president's powers are, of course, limited by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who is commander in chief of the armed forces, appoints the head of the judiciary, and has the last say on major policies. But the Americans here have a tremendous opportunity to work with the Iranians here on shared concerns, notably tensions in the region. We've already seen, throughout these, we've seen efforts made even by Raisi's government. The rocket attacks from the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria stopped after February, after the attack on Tower 22 in Jordan, where 3 U.S. soldiers were killed and dozens of Arizona National Guardsmen were injured. And we saw the Iranian government and the Iraqi government lean on the Shiite militias to tell them to knock it off, to help ease tensions here with the Americans, because the Iranians don't want a war with the United States. And then we see, after the attack on the Iranian consulate back on April 1st, they gave ample notice to the Americans after the Israelis assassinated one of Iran's top generals and his deputy among a number of civilians in Damascus on their soil, on their consulate. They, in a couple of weeks later, when they did their reprisal attack, they gave the Americans via Jordan and Turkey a 72-hour notice, so that the U.S. was more than ready to help defend Israel against the barrage of missiles and drones that were launched against Israel in their first attack on Israel proper. And so we've seen evidence here that there is not an appetite for war in Tehran. Israel is the party that continues to provoke these tensions and risk the expansion of the war throughout the whole region, picking a fight with the axis of resistance, which so many regional actors in this area do not want. I mean, there's a lot of evidence when you look at how many countries have normalized ties with Iran over the last couple of years, particularly Saudi Arabia last year in March, and that deal brokered by the Chinese. That was a landmark peace deal, not a phony peace deal like the Abraham Accords. We've seen some economic cooperation start to develop, and we've seen the Saudis make clear in instances like when the U.S. Was defending Israel against that retaliation back in April. They made clear that if you want to attack Iran over this, you are not to do it from the bases you have here in our country. And Kuwait made the same demand of the United States, according to this report in Middle East Eye that came out at the time. And so really, you have the Americans and the Israelis isolating themselves in this whole situation, where the Israelis are looking to expand the war so that they can get America to fight their enemies for them, and while they finish up their ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza, and it's just shocking to me that the American administration and the Israelis still pretend like they can continue to make these normalization agreements that just basically put a rubber stamp on their apartheid state and their treatment of the Palestinians in the midst of this genocide being carried out, let alone the risk, of Iranian missiles raining down on their Sunni neighbors. They were mostly sock puppets of the Americans, where we have, troops and other assets stationed, whether that be the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar or the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, let alone all the oil facilities in these countries that are going to be in the crosshairs of Iran in the event of a war with the United States. So I mean, it's just not in the interest of anybody except Tel Aviv for this to get out of hand. But unfortunately, it looks like the United States, as we saw from John Kirby when it was brought up to him by reporters after Pezeshkian was elected, that they just have absolutely no interest in talking to the Iranians, and this is the time when we need diplomacy the most.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that update. And everybody, we will be back with more shows later this week.
You got it. Thank you, everybody.
Mm-hmm.